what began as protests in Los Angeles against ICE actions have now escalated to what appear to be full-blown riots. But is part of this escalation the fault of the White House? But when we look carefully and peel back the layers, does this all have the hallmarks of Russian propaganda? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about a little bit deeper into the story of these 2025 LA riots. Okay, so here's the overall contours. We talked yesterday about the fact that really, on the 7th, there weren't that many protests. In fact, in LA, the mayor and governor said things were largely under control. And when we looked at the LAPD's official Twitter account, we noticed that basically there were some evening protests, some street closures, and then things largely died down, right? And the situation appeared under control. In fact, the LAPD didn't even ask for assistance from surrounding police department and counties and sheriff's offices. So it seemed very under control. But bizarrely, President Donald Trump came out and said, I'm going to be sending the National Guard into LA, despite the fact that the governor, who ostensibly is the commander of the LA National Guard, was like, or the California National Guard, was like, no, dude, we don't need these guys. But Trump said, I'm going to do it anyway under Title 10 authority. And once that was announced, suddenly you saw a huge influx, a huge increase in the number of protests. And anybody that was literally alive in 2020 knows that this is how this playbook goes. You have some protests, and if your goal is to escalate the protests, what you do is you deploy your scariest looking cops, particularly cops from federal agencies, to those sites, to ground zero, basically. And a certain class of protester, they simply can't resist going in and throwing rocks and water bottles and fireworks at uniformed police officers, right? And so what you have is, in effect, this appears to be a collision course between two of the least likable classes of people on Earth. On one hand, you have the Trump administration, right? Pro-Russian and staffed with idiots. And then you have the you have the turbo violent protesters that always love to seem to turn into rock-throwing rioters, and they are on a collision course with each other, while regular Americans look on and go, wow, it's everyone I hate suddenly fighting each other, right? It's sort of like the even dumber version of Trump versus Elon. Now, but I want you to peel back some layers with me, because things are weirder, right? Now, in the last 24 hours, we've seen a big escalation, again, in part because it has gone from a minor series of protests by fringe groups to something that has become broadly popular and almost an event in its own right. But take a look at some of the groups that are organizing these protests, right? So we have two. The first, let's see if we can find it here, is the the World Socialist website. Here we go. This was on June 7th. In Paramount, protesters blocked a street with shopping carts and a recycling bin. In fact, we saw some photos of this. Federal agents then deployed flashbang grenades and pepper balls, injuring 2 people, right? A worldwide socialist website reporters reportedly sustained injuries while documenting the protest, including a reporter who was shot in the back with a rubber bullet by a U.S. immigration officer, right? According to an attorney, right, some protesters were throwing bricks and others looked injured. So again, this sounds like a protest that turned into a riot, but I want you to note this entity here. The World Socialist website, literally a kind of janky name, a website of the International Committee of the Fourth International, somehow has full-time reporting staff. Well, when we look over at these guys, we see that they are, well, kind of weird. They've been bumping around for a long time, and they consider themselves the International Committee of the Fourth International. This is a communist organization, and you might recall, for example, that the international literally refers to communism, international communism. And during the Cold War, this was a front for the Kremlin, right? The Kremlin actually considered itself the heart and soul of international communism. And it believed that by spreading communist movements around the world, that it was in effect trying to essentially grow its own allies, expanding the Iron Curtain by installing communist governments into power. And as the Iron Curtain showed, once communists get into power, power to the people, or whatever their slogans are, tend to translate into the people can't get too much power. They can't get so much power that they vote out the communists. And when you look at who the World Socialist website defends, it includes Julian Assange, notable for running the site WikiLeaks, which published Russian-hacked emails of the DNC. Chelsea Manning, a U.S. Army intelligence analyst who leaked a number of documents, classified documents about the Iraq War, and Edward Snowden, who leaked classified documents about the National Security Administration's or National Security Agency's surveillance of American citizens. But what's notable is that both Assange and Edward Snowden, particularly Edward Snowden, who was granted asylum in Russia and currently lives in Russia. But also, the World Socialist website described the 2014 Euromaidan protests in Ukraine as a coup backed by the United States and Germany, in which the Ukrainian far right played a crucial role. Sounds a little bit like a narrative that someone else says, that Ukraine is secretly taken over by far right, perhaps neo-Nazi groups. Can we think of anyone else who said that? Who's made that claim? In fact, the World Socialist website called the Russo-Ukrainian war one-sided anti-Russian propaganda. That was in 2014. But what's more interesting is that when you look up the criticism, you see that actually the World Socialist website is basically aligned almost 100% with Russian talking points. For example, it considers Putin to be a brave anti-Western crusader. Assad, the notable dictator and former dictator and war criminal in Syria, famously put down popular protests with tremendous violence as a friend of the World Socialist website. Right? And when we look up the actual World Socialist website itself, you see that, oh boy, well, check out some of these hot takes from this site, right? For example, they describe, here's a quote from this article. World Socialist website says that the Bucha atrocity allegations, remember, this is a war crime committed in 2020 by the Russian forces in the town of Bucha, something that has been investigated by even international bodies like the UN and declared a civilian, a war crime, an atrocity. The World Socialist website says that these allegations were just a pretext for escalating NATO's war against Russia. They continue, quote, there is no reason to view the claims of a massacre in Bucha as anything other than war propaganda. Again, a quick Google search will literally show you the bodies being exhumed and numerous reports from the International Criminal Court and the UN confirmed that the Bucha massacre was a real war crime. But listen to this hot take from the World Socialist website. They claim that after 3 years of war, the narrative used by the imperialist powers, and by the way, guys, the imperialist powers to them are not the large militarized country invading its neighbor. That's Russia. They're the good guys to WSW. No. The imperialist powers are America and the West. These imperialist powers justify their provocation of poor innocent Russia and escalation of the war as being as opposed to a pack of lies, right? World Socialist website analyzed the true nature of the conflict from the very beginning, they claim. They opposed Russia's invasion as a desperate reactionary response to the oligarchy and catastrophic consequences of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. There we go. Yes, they are like, it was a catastrophe that Soviet Union fell. That sounds like Russian propaganda because that is a core Russian Putinist talking point, right? It explains that the imperialist powers, this is the West again, provoked the war and relentlessly escalated it to cement their domination of the Eurasian landmass. I've never heard of anyone refer to the Eurasian landmass except, of course, for Vladimir Putin and his propagandist philosopher, Alexander Dugin. Right? Of course, they say in every virtue war, governments claim to be acting in self-defense and focus on attention of the issue of who fired the first shot. Yeah, dude. Well, given the fact that Ukraine is defending its own territory and that Russia fired the shot, right? They say this is followed by relentless atrocity propaganda aimed at demonizing the enemy, but casualties pile up. Deeper factors are revealed. Guys, the deeper driving factor is Putin wants to take over Ukraine, and Ukraine says, I don't want to be taken over. And so it's fair to say the World Socialist website is a shill for Russian talking points, right? But then they're not alone. It's not just the World Socialist website who are deeply involved in these protests. It's also an organization called the Party for Liberation and Socialism. You can see, in fact, the protests were led by the Party for Liberation and Socialism. When we look at these guys, you see they are even more Russian shills. They call for a 90% cut to the military budget of the United States and a closure of all overseas military bases, a halt of American aid to Israel, which is actually the most reasonable, but they also support the Workers' Party of North Korea. And they say North Korea is one of the few top to bottom actually existing alternatives to the global capitalist system. Guys, if you love it, they'd be happy to have you. Why don't you move there? Right? They've defended North Korea's human rights record against criticism by the United Nations, calling it a thinly veiled justification for U.S. aggression towards North Korea. Want to point out, guys, North Korea, there are currently 0 U.S. troops fighting in North Korea. That's it. The only U.S. troops are in South Korea at the invitation of the South Korean government. Okay? Just like people say, oh, this is a Russian war, this is a war of NATO against Russia. FYI, guys, there are currently 0 NATO troops in Russia. There are currently 0 NATO troops in Ukraine fighting. So this is difficult to sit there and say, these claims don't make any sense. They only make sense if you assume that they are Russian propaganda factories, right? PSL also supports the Communist Party of China, criticizing only those Chinese economic reforms that turned it into a market socialist economy. Of course, PSL supported the Russian annexation of Crimea. See, it's only bad when a democracy does it, right? And democracies don't do they generally don't do these things. But again, they say, well, it was bad when the U.S. invaded Iraq because Iraq was a free country, but it was good when Russia invaded Crimea because Russia good, guys. Don't you understand? PSL says they did not support the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but said it was NATO's fault that it happened, right? Which, of course, is exactly what Russia says. They say we didn't want to invade Ukraine, but we had to because NATO, even though Ukraine wasn't a NATO member, wasn't really close to becoming a NATO member. And frankly, other NATO members had explicitly said that they would continue to veto Ukrainian membership, including, notably, the United States. And of course, in a statement, the PSL, awesome name, said that, quote, Russia's military intervention highlighted the plight of ethnic Russians in the Donbass. And Russia had legitimate security concerns and NATO's provocative behavior. For example, most notably, NATO admitting 0 Eastern European states in 20 years. Seems kind of weird. How was they provoking Russian aggression? Oh, also, the PSL is a supporter of President Bashar al-Assad, a notable dictator, war criminal, and Russian ally. And the PSL claims, of course, Assad never used those chemical weapons, right? Whenever something bad happens by a Russian ally, it's convenient the PSL says, hey, that's actually imperialist propaganda. But whenever the U.S. does anything bad, real or not, they lose their mind, right? So I want to point this out because it's fairly clear that while these riots are expanding and are almost certainly partially a response to the Trump administration's escalation, that there are organizations that are explicitly backed by Russia that appear to be driving this narrative, which is very strange given that this is actually that the other Russian ally, the Trump administration, seems to be on the other side of it. But we're going to take a second and we're going to talk about why this actually is something everyone wants. Now, before we talk about that, you may have noticed that I'm sort of critical of everyone. In fact, in this conflict, I just tell you out front, both sides are kind of shitheels. So you can imagine that sponsors aren't exactly clamoring to work with my YouTube channel, but that's okay because I depend on you guys to keep me honest. I'm one of the only independent voices left out here, is what it certainly feels like. And so I depend on you guys to keep me able to do this every day and speak truth to power. So you can do that by becoming a member on combatvetnews.com. It is my version of Patreon. Literally, Patreon kicked me off because I had too many bad takes. So if you want to support me, you can get any one of these tiers. It's going to get you access to an extra 2 videos a week, but notably, they are uncensored combat footage from the front lines of Ukraine. So we see the latest evolution in combat tactics, including sometimes we drop videos sent to me by the guys fighting on the front lines in today that you can't get anywhere else. Plus, you get access to the whole archive, and lieutenant tier and colonel tier get access to a weekly Q&A. The link is in the description. Thanks to all you guys that do support me. Okay. So why is it we know that Russia has a pretty big incentive to drive to create instability within the United States, right? But we also know that his ally, a Putinist ally, again, this is not my claim. Donald Trump himself has tweeted. He said, I kept bad things from happening to Putin. I protect Vladimir Putin, which should be a way more controversial statement by a U.S. President than it really is. But the fact is, you're like, why? Why does he want instability and stability? The answer is these serve everyone's objectives. Everyone, of course, but the U.S. public, right? Why is that? Well, you might notice that this has produced a lot of media. In fact, here are 2 subreddits. One is called the Greater Los Angeles subreddit. And you can see there's a bunch. In fact, all of the content is photos of the riot. In fact, there's no content at all about Los Angeles that isn't riot photos. And then you can see the R Los Angeles subreddit also contains riot photos, which ours have a different orientation. You can see this one is actually focusing on how bad the rioters are, and this one is focusing on how bad the law enforcement officers are. And so they are just escalating, right? In fact, this one is literally advocating for violence. Well, actually, no, I'm sorry. That's the president's son advocating for violence. Jesus Christ. Right? And this is absolutely preposterous. You can see the level of stupidity here. There's a Waymo being burned, right? That you might note that is a Google-owned robo-taxi, which doesn't do anything, which has nothing to do with deporting immigrants. Just burning things for the sake of burning things. But why does the Trump administration, why did it take these out? Why did it send the National Guard into California when California said we have things under control? And it appears that move escalated the violence. In fact, it explicitly escalated the violence because the PSL and the WSW said this is an escalation. We need to ramp up our violence. The answer is because the Trump administration has actually been failing on deporting immigrants. You might think, what? But I see videos all the time. Guess what, guys? ICE conducts raids all the time. And based on their staff, you know what the truth is? Usually, not always, but usually when ICE does these kind of raids, particularly with other agencies, which many of the LA raids have been, they've been joint with the ATF or with the FBI or with HSI. Generally, they are involved because there are other crimes being committed. And usually they'll sit there and go, hey, maybe we can't get this person who we think is smuggling people or guns or drugs. The ATF will raid them and they'll say, hey, we found 4 firearms and 5 guys. They go, so we can charge 4 of them with gun crimes, but we can't charge this 5th guy, but he's literally in the house. That's where ICE comes in. So ICE says, listen, we can't get him on the drug crimes, but guess what? He's associated with known criminals and he doesn't have valid status in the United States. We're going to roll him up. That's how these kind of things happen, right? So the answer is it's suddenly being amplified by these Russian leftist groups and pushing this rioting, pushing these clueless goobers towards violence and riots. But the Trump administration wants there to be escalating violence. They want to be seen as being strong in the face of anti-ICE protests because they're not actually strong at deporting. In fact, the Trump administration says they've stepped up immigration enforcement, right? And saying on social media that they make a lot of arrests every day. But you can see that when you look at average daily removals, this is from 2 weeks ago, by the way, we talked about this yesterday, the Trump administration is within 1% of the Biden administration in terms of average arrests and average removals. In fact, we looked yesterday at the official Office of Immigration Statistics, and the Trump administration has stopped publishing immigration statistics. But the last year we have data for is 2023, the Biden administration, and they deported a world record 2.4 million people. So why is it that now the Trump administration is struggling to keep up with Biden's policies, right? So, but they need, and also they are losing badly. In fact, this is a humiliating defeat for them. You might remember this guy, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, was seen as a symbol by the Trump administration, or at least he became a symbol of the Trump administration because they alleged he was a gang member. They were unable to prove it in court. They weren't able to charge him with anything. And so they ended up saying, hey, we're just going to deport this dude back to El Salvador. And the court said, no, dude, you haven't. He has a right to appeal. You can't deport him until he's finished getting due process. Well, he was sent to El Salvador. The administration told the courts to go fuck themselves. And in fact, one of the notable Trump administration officials, who is largely seen as the architect of the Trump deportation, said, let's see if I can find his exact quote here. Let's see. Stephen Miller. Here we go. Here we go. Stephen Miller. This is May 1st. This is a month and a half ago. Let's see if they'll let us actually see it. Stephen Miller literally said, here we go. Kristen Noem said a few months ago, she said, quote, there is no scenario where Abrego Garcia will be in the United States again. Right? This is another, here's Stephen Miller has a full-blown temper tantrum. When asked, right, Stephen Miller said Abrego Garcia had an extensively documented membership in MS-13, but so extensively documented that none of that was ever brought out in court. And he was a clear and present danger to the safety of the American people, but again, never charged for the crimes. However, most importantly, he said that basically this guy was never coming back, that he was a terrorist. And, well, here's the problem. He's back. Right. In fact, June 6th, Trump administration followed a Supreme Court order to bring him back to the United States. Now, the DOJ said they're going to charge him, but surely as an illegal, violent criminal, it should be comically easy for the U.S. to charge this criminal. Instead, they got him with unlawfully transporting illegal aliens for financial gain and unlawful transportation of illegal aliens for financial gain. That's a pretty low bar. That could be as little as accepting $25 to give somebody a ride. For a dangerous, frightening criminal, that's a really pretty boring charges. But this is fascinating. So what you have is the Trump administration who's failing on immigration. They're number one, the thing they were elected to do. They're humiliated as the one thing they swore they would never, ever, ever, ever do under any circumstances, return this guy before from El Salvador. They were forced to do. And now Putinist groups are pushing a narrative of violence, driving people towards violent confrontations with law enforcement, and Trump is saying, thank you, Vladimir Putin, for creating this powder keg that I can deploy federal law enforcement to. And there's going to be a ton of, it's going to make it appear that I'm doing something. Everyone is going to be distracted. No one is going to see the fact that I'm losing in pretty humiliating fashion at doing the one job I was elected to do. Everybody wins, except, of course, for the American people. We continue to lose as, of course, right, as we saw, a bunch of self-driving cars, a bunch of businesses are all being burned. Those cops, by the way, have other jobs to do, right? Am I stoked that Border Patrol is being diverted to, like, shoot tear gas at a bunch of socialists in LA? No, that's a waste of their time. And I think even they would tell you that, right? They would much rather be, I don't know, interdicting drug smugglers at the border. Like, whatever you feel about immigration, nobody's pro fucking fentanyl. So why don't we see those guys, right? Every one of those cops should be doing something else, right? Somebody in LA isn't going to get a robbery investigated because the person who's supposed to investigate it is having to, push around a bunch of leftists throwing water bottles. This is all stupid. This is all bad governance. This is theater instead of actually running the country well. And ultimately, that is what Russia really wants. They want a country that is so badly run, so corrupted, so rotten that it is unable to stop Russia from enacting its policies. That's what's worked so far. Look, Putin hasn't de-escalated his war. Everything the administration has done has played into Putin's hands. Ukraine has never been weaker. Russia has never escalated the war more. Right? Ukraine is increasingly turning to desperate actions because they don't have support from other major countries, particularly the United States. So all of this is just nonsense and theater. Anyway, guys, huge thank you to our Colonel tier members that let me do these kinds of videos, like James J21, Yanko Georgiev, Chris Gorsuch, Paul Templeton, Cytronic, Steve Moran, TR Need, Ellen Litson, CM Holmes, all of our Lieutenant tier members. You guys are the ones who make this whole thing possible. Thank you guys. As always, hit the subscribe button if you think this content's valuable, and I will see you guys in the next one. Cheers.